lost as you'd expect in all the noise about last week's budget spend-a-thon and the ongoing debate about a COVID roadmap to reopening have been some pretty seismic developments for how we see ourselves as Australians. You see, so much Indigenous policy is not about how to help Aboriginal people better, it's about how we see ourselves as Australians, or told to see ourselves. Are we a country where everyone gets a fair go, especially if they're prepared to have a go, to borrow the Prime Minister's phrase? Or are we a country that is fundamentally racist, as some want us to believe, because our very foundation involved an unjust dispossession of the original inhabitants? On the weekend, the acting Premier of Victoria, where else, announced Australia's first truth-telling commission into the wrongs, he says, committed against Aboriginal people after white settlement in Victoria. On the back of the treaty, the Victorian government is also working to push through. It's another way for those who are supposed to be our leaders to seek to divide. Into this process, there will no doubt be a litany of claims. It's based on the South African model, its Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that was set up in the aftermath of the apartheid era coming to an end. Then, in South Africa, it was about crimes and atrocities committed within living memory, measured in months and years. Here in Victoria, what's expected are claims going back to the 17 and 1800s. And with a $58 million budget, that's right, $58 million, it's part of a well-thought-out political strategy to soften us up for a so-called treaty with Aboriginal Victorians, as if they're somehow a nation separate from the rest of the country. Again, to divide Victorians, not unite them. Nothing like the once laudable aim of reconciliation. Indeed, unlike the South African model, there's no reconciliation word in the Daniel Andrews Commission. But don't just think it's left-wing Labor governments like Victoria's that are going down this path. A fortnight ago, the South Australian Liberal government announced it was establishing an Indigenous voice to the state parliament, eventually to be elected in what's a transparent attempt to frog march the federal Liberal government into doing the same thing. Now, I don't support a separate voice to the parliament, any way, shape or form. I don't support it. Because for too long, we have fought to open up our Western democracies to electing our representatives by a vote that isn't qualified or restricted by whether you're a man or not, or a landowner or not, which is, of course, how it once was. So why in 2021 would we want to create two classes of voter in this country, where one group of Australians, by virtue of their race alone, effectively get two votes? One for the voice to Parliament, and then a second vote, along with the rest of us, for the Parliament itself. As it seems, we're all equal in the coming Australia, but in George Orwell's phrase, some are more equal than others. Meanwhile, amidst all this activist talk of treaties and voices and white guilt for the alleged atrocities of a century ago or more, Aboriginal people continue to suffer in ways that no Australian should, and in ways that the mainstream media never wants to discuss. The latest figures out today from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare show that nearly 1 in 6 Indigenous children accessed child protection services last year. That's 8 times the rate for non-Indigenous children. So what's more important? Raking over the coals of history, several generations removed from today, that we can do nothing to change other than perhaps taxpayer compensation or more division in a country growing more divided by the day, or tackling the dysfunction that exists right now in so many Indigenous communities. It says everything, doesn't it, that so many Indigenous leaders, and to be fair, virtue signalling politicians of all ancestries, would rather dwell on the past that they can't change rather than the present and the future that they can and should change. But as courageous Indigenous leaders like Jacinta Price keep pointing out, and I quote, as long as Aboriginal leaders insist, without clear evidence, but it's all caused by racism and colonisation, we cannot begin to reduce homicide, violence and sexual abuse. By all means, let's have these truth-telling commissions provided they're prepared to start with today's truth. The truth that black families will be safe when kids go to school and adults go to work and the ordinary law of the land is enforced, as a former Prime Minister once said. The truth too that black women will be safe when black men stop hitting them. For as Price has pointed out, out of the nearly 1,000 Indigenous people lost to homicide over the past 20 years, more than 3/4 were killed by Indigenous perpetrators, and nearly 70% were classified domestic homicides. That truth too needs to be told if we're really to make the difference we must make for the women and children in particular of our first Australians.